In May, the people of Vanuatu will be asked to vote on a referendum aiming to overcome the country's persistent issues with political instability. The government is aiming to end party hopping and to force independents to join political parties, and the public are to have the final say on 29th of May. Don Wiseman spoke with Victoria University of Wellington comparative politics professor Jonathan Fraenkel, who says the constitutional changes being planned won't have the effect the politicians are seeking.
There's long been a desire to try and stabilise Vanuatu's parliament because there were 3 changes of government last year, and there's been more changes of government in Vanuatu than in any Pacific Island country. No confidence votes, MPs switching sides, crossing the floor. So the reformers, quite understandably, have wanted to try and use legislation to put a halt to this. So they've got 2 constitutional amendments that are going to go to this referendum in May. The first one, called 17A, states that members of parliament need to be affiliated to political parties, and the second one, 17B, says that you can't have independents, basically. The independents have 3 months in order to decide which political party they want to join. These are the 2 things that are going to be put to a nationwide referendum that needs a simple majority in order to pass.
So, is that going to work?
No, I don't think it will work. I think that the legislation is poorly drafted, and there is an experience with these kind of laws in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and in both cases they had unforeseen repercussions. They didn't do what was expected. In Papua New Guinea, the Supreme Court ruled crucial parts of the legislation unconstitutional in 2010, and in Solomon Islands they failed to pass the necessary constitutional amendment, and it actually encouraged MPs to contest as independents rather than as members of political parties. Politicians tend to be very devious and to find their way around these things and to find loopholes in the legislation, and there are lots of loopholes in the legislation as it's been formulated so far.
Yes, there are a whole lot of questions with this, aren't there? There may be concerns about votes of no confidence coming too frequently, but they're an essential tool of the democratic process, aren't they?
That's right. I mean, certainly in Papua New Guinea, there's been times where if you didn't have a vote of no confidence, you'd have blood on the streets or rioting or something like that. Sometimes, sure, there are a lot of frivolous no confidence votes in Western Melanesia where people are just out to grab ministerial portfolios, but there are also important votes of no confidence that are absolutely decisive. Don, the decisive thing with this legislation, you can go through all the loopholes, you could clean them up, you could airbrush the whole thing, you could make it absolutely watertight so that devious politicians couldn't get around it. But fundamentally, at root, these kind of laws require the setting up or the expansion of the powers of constitutional officers, usually the Speaker or the Principal Elections Officer or the Clerk, these constitutional officers that are required to behave in a non-partisan way. But the laws actually make them very, very intrusive. So that the Speaker, the Principal Election Officer, starts to make decisions about the internal mechanics of political parties. Who's the president? Who's the vice president? Who's the treasurer? Who's a legitimate candidate? Who's not a legitimate candidate? Those are very, very politicized decisions, and it's extremely difficult to get people who can do that kind of decision-making in a non-partisan way. For Melanesian countries, it's hard enough to get a central bank governor or an anti-corruption commissioner that behaves in a neutral way. To have someone in such a politicized role is really, really even more difficult. No country in the world does this effectively.
Papua New Guinea did have a registrar who made some very substantial decisions and announcements, but they were very much largely ignored. And there have not been any people sent down for swapping parties anyway up there, have there? Yes,
that's right. Well, but also, the first registrar who was appointed, no accident, was a guy called Paul Bengo, who was a CPIC man from Sir Michael Samare's area, and he was also Chief Secretary, I think, for Sir Michael Samare, so it was a highly politicised appointment. And all the way through all the successors also, they were very beholden to government. It's very difficult to get a neutral office taker. But yes, you're right. A lot of the time, I mean, they really struggle to do anything. This Vanuatu legislation talks about a deregistration of political parties, but Paul Bengo and the Registrar's Office in Papua New Guinea, they've really struggled to deregister any political parties. And as you say, not one single MP lost their seat as a result of the imposition of those party laws. That's true in the Solomons as well.
In terms of this effort to achieve some sort of political stability and maintaining it, what is it? that these countries can do.
The Westminster system requires governments to always command a majority in the House. That's the whole basis of that system. You can move towards a presidential system where the head of government has a direct popular mandate, but that in itself has all sorts of complications. The problem with some of the legislation being considered is that it gets the worst of both worlds. You get a Westminster system without the ability to remove a government mid-term, but you don't get the presidential system with a direct popular mandate. Well, there are some things that can be done with a Westminster system. For example, Kiribati has a provision: if you have a successful vote of no confidence, you have an immediate dissolution of the parliament and you go to a fresh election. That's a massive disincentive to holding a no confidence vote. I think the problem with a lot of the legislation that's been experimented with in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and now in Vanuatu is that it seeks to establish a new constitutional office or empower an existing constitutional office in ways that are highly politicized. And we know from the experience of Melanesian politics that these offices will be manipulated, usually by the government of the day, but sometimes in Vanuatu, if there's a mid-term change of government, the speaker can be aligned with the opposition. So these things are very, very vulnerable to manipulation, and that manipulation will happen. I think the answer here is to try and tie the party strengthening legislation into the electoral system. Usually this is done through a proportional electoral system. And Vanuatu has the advantage that it already has multi-member districts. It just needs a few changes in order to align the electoral system better with a party strengthening mechanism.